Well, welcome to another episode of Persuasion, or the Art of Feminine Negotiation. This is Cindy, and thanks for joining us today. I'm so glad that you're here, and I cannot wait for you to hear today's episode. But before we dive in, though, just wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you are looking to up-level your negotiation skills. I've got everything from online to group to my signature one-on-one mastermind or VIP experiences available to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. So check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com if that sounds interesting to you. And now on to the reason that you are here today for our program. So happy to introduce you to Jen Smith today. We're going to be talking about how to negotiate your way out of debt. So welcome, Jen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Cindy.
Thrilled to have you here. And post-COVID in particular, I think this is no doubt a subject near and dear to the hearts of many as people are struggling to try and get out of some of the economic consequences for the last couple of years. And for those of you who don't know Jen Smith is a personal finance expert, and she's also co-host of the top-rated Frugal Friends podcast. You'll have to check that out if you haven't. And since paying off a $78,000 debt of her own in only 2 years, Jen's been on a mission to help people spend in alignment with their values and to live for today while saving for tomorrow. And she's going to share some golden gems with you here today on how you can do that too. She's the author of 2 best-selling books on controlling your spending and paying off debt, the No Spend Challenge Guide, and Pay Off Your Debts for Good. And we'll make sure to put the links for both of those in our show notes. So tell us, Jen, how did you first come to do this line of work?
So I did not start out in finance, in anything economics related. I went to school for acupuncture and I got my master's in that. But that led me to $50,000 of debt. So when I met my now husband, he was just getting out of school and had about $24,000 of debt. And he said, the first thing I want to do when we get married is pay off my debt. And I was like, absolutely not. I've been living with this debt and a really low income because I chose to go into a line of work that was very gratifying but very low paying. So I was like, I'm finally getting this second income. I'm not going to waste it on paying off debt. But he really encouraged me to see what our bigger dreams in life could be and how much easier it could be to achieve those without the debt. So he got me on board when I started dreaming about that. And it took us, what we thought would take 5 years, took us 2 years to pay off a combined, with everything, $78,000 of debt. And then that's how I started writing about personal finance. I just wanted to help people learn what I had learned the hard way, but maybe a little easier, like on the internet. And that is what led me to starting a podcast with my co-host Jill, which is now what I do full time.
I love that. Great podcast and definitely a great subject. And I mean, but as I mentioned in the intro, like now in particular, I think people are struggling in a way that we probably really haven't seen for our generation. And boy, did that resonate when you talk about your student loan debt. I remember when I finished law school, I'm dating myself here, but I happened to have the misfortune of graduating at the time when interest rates were at 18%. It was that horrific time back in the 80s when things had just gone crazy. And back then with student loans, you couldn't even just buy them out. You were sort of locked into that. So I was locked in for years at this obscene 18% interest rate. It felt some days like you could just never get your head above water. So why don't we start with what, if any, impact has COVID had on the work that you're doing? What are you seeing the impact of that being for people?
Yeah, so I think in 2020, we were seeing a lot of people start to save where they had normally just been able to go out and spend whatever they wanted to. They no longer could. So they couldn't leave their houses. And if they wanted to buy something online and they didn't have Prime, they were going to have to wait. Yeah. So it wasn't, there was less of this impulse spending that was available to people. And so I think some people really took that as like a, dang, I'm spending so much more than I thought, and look how much I can save. And they really took that and ran with it. Then in 2021, we had the other half of people that are like, I haven't been able to spend any money for a year. I'm going all out. And so we've kind of seen that this catch up, even in people that were doing a little better in 2021, by now we're seeing this catch up and kind of making up for lost time mentality.
Yeah, I love that. I actually hadn't even thought of that, to be honest, about that sort of forced restriction on that impulse buying. I was thinking more just of people not having that income. So today I definitely want to let you dig into sort of both the mindset piece as well as some practical how-to advice. Why don't we start with the mindset piece? I always say the first and most important negotiation we have is with ourselves. So what advice do you have for our listeners out there on how they can negotiate their mindset around the idea about debt and maybe some of their old practices?
Yeah, before I started paying off debt, I really thought mindset was like this woo-woo, like I don't need it. I'm fine. I just need the tactical stuff. And I've seen over the years how much that mentality held me back for so long. And when I finally was like, okay, the way I think is directly impacting the way I spend or the way I view finances, that really shifted things for me. And so for a lot of our listeners, or really the people that don't know they want to listen to our show yet, they are thinking managing my money and getting my finances together means I'm going to have to deprive myself. I'm going to be living on beans and rice. You can kiss fun goodbye.
Yeah.
I'm not ready for that. I'll do that later. And we're trying to reframe and give people this mindset shifts to say you can manage your finances and feel confident about your finances. What a concept, like feeling confident about your money, and live a life you love, because people think that they love everything. They want to be able to spend money on anything because we're adults. We don't want to be told no. But you can spend money on anything. You can love anything, but you can't love everything. And so a lot of it comes down to just figuring out, what do I want to spend money on and what I don't want to spend money on.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of the reframe. I love that you've sort of spoke to that elephant in the room, because same for me with my work. It's about reframing how people think about what success is, reframing how you look at negotiation, right? Because all of life is a negotiation. And you talked about that sort of biggie. I think some people hear the word frugality and associate it with another F word, or
yes,
or think frugal equals
yes.
cheap. So how do we balance that frugality with living a full life?
So first, it really comes down to knowing your core values and what you want from life. So everybody, wants to spend more time with their family, their friends. They want to do fulfilling work. So those things everybody wants. But like, what are the core values that really make you uniquely you? The unique things that you bring to your relationships and your work and all of that. And how does that impact the way you want to practice these things? Like with law, I mean, there's a basic law degree, but there are so many ways to practice it based on what you value. And so that's the first thing, is we figure out what we value, and then we plan around that. You make a financial plan around that, and then figure out how to execute that plan and stay motivated.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, I don't think we often don't really explore our core values. Like, it amazes me, even, in a different sphere, but in working with my clients about getting them to negotiate their best life, I have them do a time audit exercise. And it's amazing to me how people spend the majority of their time doing things that they don't even enjoy. And the things that they would have listed as their priorities, if they'd taken time to think about it, aren't even showing up on their radar. So I really love this approach, Jen, about tapping into what your core values are. And give us, if you can get a little deeper on that, how does that show up in terms of core values vis-a-vis your finances? I think most people wouldn't put those two together.
Right. It's really easy, if you're just going through the motions, to end up living according to somebody else's core values. And it's usually the people marketing products or marketing the American dream. You end up living according to their values, which is buy the stuff I'm making. But when you nail down what you value and what you love and the type of person you are, you can more easily identify those marketing techniques and you spend less. You can know without a doubt, I don't spend money on these things anymore. No matter what my family is telling me or my friends are telling me, these are the things I no longer spend money on, so that there's more space to spend money on the things that I love without guilt. Because sometimes when we make a budget, even when we're budgeting in things that we love, sometimes we can feel guilty about spending on them because we feel like we should be putting more towards investing or saving or whatever. But when you give yourself permission to say no to some things so that you can say more yes to others, you
Yes.
can remove that guilt piece in spending.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you've touched on that, because I think for women in particular, we do tend to martyr ourselves a little bit, and we feel self-indulgent, right? We don't do even basic self-care sometimes, let alone being able to have those priorities and those so-called indulgences. What are some of the big culprits that you find, like when you're talking about that generally, that, because boy, the marketing, so true, right? It pits us up. So we got to keep up with the Joneses. What do you find are some of the
Mhm.
biggest culprits that your clients really fall victim to?
Well, it's not even so much like marketing on TV anymore, like, or maybe it hasn't ever been, but really like the people around you. So your family is a big culprit on how much you spend, especially like your kids, your partner. Like I have a 3-year-old son, and everyone was telling me before I gave birth, oh, you're going to spend so much money on this kid. Your house is going to go to shambles with toys. And I'm like, no, because he doesn't really need
Yes.
every single toy he wants. And so, so I think our kids can be a really big culprit. Our friends, not even knowingly, nobody tries to get you to spend money ill intention. They always want you to be living your best life and taking care of yourself. But like self care doesn't look like a spa day.
Yeah.
Self care looks like you doing what makes you come alive. And maybe manicures make you come alive, but 9 times out of 10, it's not a manicure that just lights you up. So that's the kind of self-care that we're trying to like transition people to think of.
And what a great shift, because it's about those life experiences, right? When I
Mm-hmm.
have people set their goals, I always like them to look at all of the categories of their life. And it's usually those experiences that light us up, and as opposed to getting things, right? So,
Yeah.
and boy, when you said about the kids, I some of it to do over again. I think when our kid, we started late and made up for lost time. We had 3 kids in 3 years. And when I think about the money, the inordinate amount of money we spend on like brand new, the big Fisher Price toy sets, we had whole kitchens and little mini garages that they never ever played with. Like we ended up giving them away, sort of donating them on down the line, and they were barely ever touched. So no, and when you talked about what the thing that stuck in my mind when you'd said about that sort of comparing ourselves to other people, right? Wanting to keep up. I remember there was a study, I can't remember if it was Stanford, one of the big universities, and it amazed me, Jen. I'd love your sort of feedback on this in terms of your client experience, where people were given a choice in a study that they could make, I forget what the figures are, but X amount of money that would be more than enough money to cover all of their needs and then some, but it would be less than their neighbors, or they could make a certain amount of money that wouldn't be enough to cover all of their needs, but would be more than their neighbors or contemporaries. And in staggering numbers, the majority of people chose the worst lifestyle if they felt like it put them above others. I'd love your input on that, or your feedback about that.
It's interesting. Like people naturally want to be part of a tribe. We naturally want to connect to each other. And that kind of like also means we also kind of naturally want to compete with each other too. So I guess coming from my perspective, I'm like, oh man, give me the money. Like I don't care about other people. But there are a lot of people who, especially if your neighbors are not the greatest, could kind of want to do that because it's a satisfaction. Our greatest needs are not monetary. Our greatest needs are like self-actualization and esteem and the things on the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can't buy those. And so some people, I mean, it's easy to make a decision that's based on that versus financially sound decisions. And it sound like when you say it, it's like, who would do that?
Yeah.
But like that's kind of the stuff that's coming in your mind. I'm like, there's definitely been times in my life, and I'm sure other people's lives, where we've chosen to kind of to choose those top parts of the hierarchy of needs versus the more practical foundational needs.
Yeah. Well, and it comes back to that mindset piece, right? I mean, it's about owning your own value internally so that you don't need to be competing with other people, especially in today's world. And I love that you'd said it's not just that sort of TV marketing. I wonder, like a big part of it, I think, is in these sort of Instagram lives where everybody's posting these glorious, perfect lives, and we're all running, feeling the need to compete, as opposed to just judging, as you said so beautifully, what are your core values? What are the experiences that are most important to you? So you can focus on that rather than living a life based on somebody else's expectations. I thought that was gorgeous. So let's talk brass nuts. You guys paid off $78,000 of debt in 2 years. So tell us a little bit about how you did that. What are some of the practical tips around that?
Yeah, so we were not making a crazy high income. I was probably making $35,000 a year at my primary job. I was working part-time because I could not get more hours. And then I worked at a foster group home on the weekends. So on a good year, I would say I was making 45. And then my husband was unemployed when we started because he was just out of school. So it was not a great starting point, and definitely one where it had to be not even mindset. It was just like, I just can't care about anything. I'm just going to start. Like one of those. Because so many people are like, I'm going to start when I'm in a better financial place. That's false. You're not going to start when you're in a better financial place. When I got married and had a second income, was not going to start. So stop believing that lie. So we just started. And slowly but surely, quickly, my husband got a job. Slowly but surely, we started shaving off some expenses, increasing our income. I personally thought I could just side hustle my way out of debt, that I wouldn't have to change any of my spending because I was buying the generic brands at the grocery store. So that meant that I was frugal. And I worked so many side hustles, and that lasted for 2 months. And then I got shingles because of the stress of overworking. And I realized, okay, I'm not going to be able to side hustle my way out of debt. I am going to have to focus more heavily on my spending. And that's when I realized buying generic doesn't make you frugal. Being intentional with all of your purchases is what makes you frugal. And it didn't mean I had to give up lattes or, the other superfluous stuff people think you have to give up or assume you have to give up. It meant I just had to look at my spending and be like, what are the things I really love and what are the things I don't really love? And cut from that section first.
Yeah. And great advice, that just start, right? I often call that the 1-day mindset, when it's like, I'm going to do this when that, or when I hit this mark, or when this happens.
Mm-hmm.
Keep putting it off and it doesn't. And again, if you could give, just for our listeners to get some context, like what in your, and I know it depends on people's core values, but what are some of the things, suggestions you would have, the areas where people can maybe start looking, where when people start shaving, that it starts having that impact? What are some areas that you would encourage them to maybe take a look at in their life?
Yeah, so definitely look at you. So you probably have a fun section of your budget and a not fun section. And people usually ignore the not fun section because it's like your mortgage and your bills and things that seem fixed. And I would challenge you to think nothing is fixed. Nothing is fixed. Worst case scenario, you could downsize your house and move to a cheaper area, and that is not fixed. So obviously, worst case scenario, that's not the first place you're going to go. But nothing is fixed. So start with that not fun part of your budget and try to shave off as much there as you do from the fun side. Because if we're just looking at the discretionary expenses and not looking at the semi-fixed expenses, that's going to be an unrealistic budget, because you have to have fun and enjoyment and values-based spending in your budget that you don't feel guilty about. So when you are shaving off of your budget, always start on either side, because usually that not fun side, you can get a lot larger chunks off a lot easier than just kind of nickel and diming on the other side, on the fun side.
That is a great approach, actually, because I think it's one of the reasons people always dread this idea about getting out of debt, because they assume it means their life's going to become an absolute drudgery because they have to give up everything fun. So what are some examples you can think of that most people don't think? And I love this idea about nothing is fixed. I think that's a great starting point, right? What are some of the examples of those sort of not fun side items that maybe people can look at or get a little creative about in your experience?
Yeah, so the easiest one, I think, is your cell phone bill. There are so many pay-per-use providers now, and they are getting better and better coverage, better and better phones. So there's really no excuse if you are on an expensive cell phone plan.
Yeah.
Check out one of these pay-per-use providers. Also, negotiating every bill that you have like once a year. So we're fortunate enough to have two internet provider options so that we can negotiate between them and leverage each other. So that is something that we're able to do. We can't do it with electricity and utilities. We can try to lower our usage there, but there are a lot of different bills where if you have more than one provider option, you can leverage them next to each other to try and get lower rates. Or typically it turns out like if our provider is raising a rate, we can just show them what the other company is offering us and they will not raise it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And so you hit the magic word for me, bing, bing, bing. Negotiating, obviously. And it's true. People don't think about negotiating some of this stuff. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, Jen, like insurance, right? Whether it's your home insurance, car insurance. I mean, people just keep paying, the rates go up. And you absolutely can leverage that if you go back and challenge, whether it's your phone provider. I can't think how many times when I've gone and said, hey, we're thinking about switching. This is untenable. And suddenly they're offering much better rates than we had.
Yeah.
Great piece of advice.
And if you're nervous about negotiating big things like salaries and deals, when you start with small things like this, it builds your confidence so that you can make those bigger negotiations. So it's really like no brainer to be negotiating small stuff like this.
Yeah. And I love that you're broaching that, because I think people shy away from negotiation often thinking it's going to be conflict, because we have been so conditioned to see negotiation as, picture people in the boardrooms where it's an adversarial model, and you can show up with absolute grace and humor and, be building rapport and bring empathy to the table and get, framing it even just, I'm curious, I just received some stuff that are offering me these same services that seem to be at a way better cost point, and just get curious and ask the questions. And it's amazing, how much benefit you can get from having those simple negotiations. So thanks so much.
Definitely. And that works much better than being adversarial. They definitely want to work with you more when you're being nice and empathetic.
Yeah, no, that's my whole model. I call it the art of feminine negotiation, because it's, if you look at what make the best negotiators, it's actually tapping into those so-called feminine traits. And that's not gender-based, right? I mean, we all have masculine and feminine, but it's about getting away from that competitive, take no prisoners approach, and getting really intentional about bringing empathy and trusting your intuition and building trust and being flexible and building that rapport. So now habits can either make or break us. So what advice can you share with us about how to maybe transform some of those habits that cause us to overspend? I know you do a lot about sort of overspending and how to curb that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Definitely. I love studying habits and talking about habits. If your listeners haven't read Atomic Habits by James Clear, I highly recommend it. It's not just going to help you, physically and professionally, but also in your spending, because so much of the money we spend is just out of habit. It's like getting the latte on the way to work, or picking up dinner on the way home, or going out to lunch with your coworkers. All of this stuff we don't even think about. And that's great. Our brain really appreciates not having to think 100% of the day. But it's reworking those unhealthy habits, or maybe I like to say limiting habits, the limiting habits to be like growth habits. And so how can I be intentional about my time and intentionally create these growth habits so that later on down the line, I don't have to think as much about sticking to my budget or reaching my financial goals, because I just created habits that help me do it naturally.
Nice. And tell us a bit, when you say growth habits, for our listeners' benefit as well, can you elaborate on that a little bit for us? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Okay, so an example, my favorite growth habit is meal planning and meal prepping, anything to do with food, because it makes your life much easier when you can just create a habit of every Sunday at 5 p.m. I meal plan, buy my groceries online, have them delivered or pick them up the next day, whatever. And that's just an ingrained habit. And sometimes you can stack these habits on other things. So typically I will grocery shop in bed. That time where I used to, on a Sunday nights where I used to just be on Instagram, is now me grocery shopping. So I at first stacked it onto the Instagram. I was like, I can't go on Instagram until I grocery shop. And that was like my little reward for it. And then also doing some like meal prepping. So for me, that's just as simple as when I cook a dinner, I immediately take 2 portions, put them in a Tupperware container, and then we eat the rest. That way, I already have lunches prepared for my husband and I for the next day. And that's a habit, and that helps me from going out to lunch with people or getting fast food. So it's those habits that over time save money unintentionally.
And so powerful, right? Those habits we build. I like that phrase. I hadn't heard that before about the growth habits, building those growth habits. I think that's great. And tell us about your no spend challenge. I know you've got a book by that name as well, the No Spend Challenge Guide, but tell us, what is the No Spend Challenge? How does that work?
So a no spend challenge, you can call it like a spending detox or whatever. It goes by many names, but it's essentially just not spending any money on any discretionary items for a period of time. So I like a month. You can start with a week or a weekend, whatever suits you. But it's less of a like a diet detox where we're like, oh, I'm just going to stop eating for a day and then tomorrow I'm going to eat great. No, you will for sure yo-yo in it if you view it like that. It's very similar to dieting. So in a no spend challenge, when you are taking away all discretionary spending, it forces you to disrupt the triggers for a lot of mindless habits. And so when you disrupt those triggers and you say, oh, like, how did I find myself in line at Chipotle? I'm not supposed to be here. And then you walk out because you're on a no spend challenge. You start to identify those things and you're like, man, how many times have I ended up in line at Chipotle and brought it home and not really thought about it? So it's how we, at the end of the month, we get to the spending, like we look at our transactions. If you do that and you're like, how did I spend all this money? It's usually habitual or mindless. So the no spend challenge just helps you, puts a stop between you and your spending so you can start to identify all of those in a short period of time so that you can start working on them.
Oh, so great. So the no spend challenge actually marries up to this habit changing that we're looking to do, I guess. Great.
Yeah, it tells you what your habits are and maybe what you need to do to change them. So like if I stop at get takeout on the way home from work every day, then if it's the same takeout, maybe I take a different route home from work or I leave at a different time, like to disrupt the cue for that habit.
Yeah, habits are just, they're so deeply ingrained, like our conditioning. So when you, anything you can do to shake that up definitely helps get us on the path. So now we talked about frugality in one context. I'd love if you could speak to frugality and how it works in business and entrepreneurship. I think some people see resistance there, right? So I'd love if you could maybe do a lot of work on that.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. I still learning. Definitely a frugality expert. I'm definitely not a business expert. Yeah. So I'm still learning how to balance where do I find my values in business? Because it's the same way. Our core values are the things that impact our relationships and our work and all these other parts of our lives. And so like I know my core value, one of them is achieving. I like to finish things. And sometimes I have to fight with that. Like sometimes things aren't worth finishing. And so knowing that that's one of my core values can also see where I'm using that value unhealthily. So realizing that and making sure I'm spending my money on the highest impact things, making sure I'm spending my time on the highest impact things. And that sometimes means spending money where I normally wouldn't, like hiring VAs to do things that I know I could do on my own, but are not the best use of my time. And time really is the only finite resource we have. It's our most important resource. And so that is really, it's why we're frugal with our money, is to have more time for other things. So that's really an important thing to prioritize. And it's helped me slowly but surely figure out how to spend my time and money in my business more wisely.
Yeah, I love that advice because I think we often ignore that and we stretch ourselves so thin doing things that do not make sense for us in our business, right? Like my time would be better spent building clients or doing this, or, billing out at X amount of money. And when I'm sitting here doing this, I'd be way better served, as you say, whether getting a VA or hiring a staff or having that team. And sometimes people think they're being frugal by not doing it. So I love that you layer that time piece on, right? Recognizing there's a balance there. Valuing your time sometimes can perhaps be the most frugal exercise in our business. Such great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, do you see any gender differences in dealing with debt, either accumulating or being able to sort of pay it off? What's been your experience around that?
Honestly, I don't see a difference. It's really person to person. There are women who say they love to spend money. Like, I would push back against that and say, like, you don't love to spend money. You get an, adrenaline rush when you spend it. And then there are men that love it, say they love it too. And then there are women who are like extremely frugal and almost hate to spend money. And then there are men that do that too. So there's literally no difference in genders. I think we just equate it more towards women because females typically are the primary purchaser in their families. So we just see them buy more because that's usually the role that falls on them. But there is really no difference.
Yeah, interesting. And again, it's an interesting perspective. I was thinking more just because, women have such baggage often around money issues, and with good reason. I mean, it's not that long ago in history that we weren't able to hold property or have credit in our own name and whatever. So I think for a lot of women, there's a lot of deep rooted conditioning that we're not even conscious of around money and how to spend it. So that's interesting that in the overspending field that you see that sort of equal distribution. So now let's say that we've gotten ourselves into a real pickle, right? And, with a debt that just seems absolutely unmanageable. And I know you've touched on some of that for us already, but what are some practical steps that our listeners can take to get out of debt, right? When you're just feeling, this has become unmanageable. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now.
Yeah, the first step would be to get everything out on paper. Literally write it down, pencil or pen to paper, because when we physically write things down, we feel it more, it feels more concrete. And you could think that that feels overwhelming, but it actually has the opposite effect. When you see it on paper and you've written it, you actually see that it's not as bad. Most of the times you see it's not as bad as you thought it was. And then listing out our debts in order, you can do it in order of size or interest rate, depending on, what you prefer. Typically, paying off larger interest rates is better, and those usually have smaller balances too. So if you have like a few like really small balance loans that maybe you want to just clear out to like consolidate things, fine. You do you. We live in the radical middle. We don't pick a side on how you should do it, whatever works best for you. And then just make a plan to how you're going to start paying it off. And know that the plan you make now is not the plan you'll have in 3 months or even 6 months or a year. The more you're doing it, the better you get at it. And I see this from so many people. It's the faster you complete your goal. And so don't be worried. Like literally, we thought it was going to take us 5 years to pay off our debt, and it took us 2. I hear that same story so often. So don't be intimidated by how long you think it's going to take, how little you have to put into it now. Just start making a plan little by little, paying off one loan at a time. Focus on one debt at a time, which I don't care which one it is, one debt at a time while making minimum payments to all the others. And that's kind of just the like one day at a time thing. We just start small and we do more as we get better.
Yeah. And you've hit on a really important point there that I hadn't thought about, which is this idea that, when you're making your plan now, this isn't the forever plan, right? I mean, it's going to change as you're going through the process. So when people are first starting, especially if this isn't that familiar to them, what do you suggest normally for those increments? Like how often, when should you build in to go back and re-examine the plan and make whatever tweaks you need to?
You usually naturally like replan as your income increases, so you have more in your budget, so then you naturally have more to put towards your debt or whatever other financial goal you have. And so once you see a pattern of that, you're like, oh, I think our goal, we could achieve it earlier. Let's kind of reevaluate. So that usually comes naturally as a result of paying attention to your budget and intentionally pursuing goals.
Nice. Nice. Now it came up sort of naturally talking a bit about negotiation there, and you'd said about, getting away from that adversarial, that it's a better way to get results. Any other tips that you have for us on how to best sort of navigate those negotiations around debt? I know with financial institutions in particular, when you've got creditors breathing down your neck for people, that can be just so overwhelming and challenging, and people just throw their hands up. So any tips on how to negotiate those from your experience?
Yeah, you are talking to human beings, honestly. Like, they are human beings. So you don't need a professional, like, expert loan consolidator to negotiate on your behalf. You can do it yourself. You can be persistent and kind. And the worst you'll hear is no. And maybe you call back later or the next day and see what you can get. But there's usually, especially with medical debt and credit card debt, any debt that's in collections are the most negotiable. Student loans, car loans, mortgages, not as easy.
Yeah.
But where there's a will, there's a way. I believe like no expense or interest rate is fixed, is truly fixed.
Yes.
So, but I would start with if you have like credit cards, or medical debt or any debt in collections, those are usually the easiest to negotiate on. And you can use the same skills that you've heard like in this podcast you're listening to right now, in the past episodes on, you can use those same techniques to negotiate with any of these companies. You do not have to hire somebody to do it for you.
Great advice. And I really like that piece too about that. Don't see any of these as non-negotiable. I remember that first time that light went off for me, because you always assume the interest rates are the interest rates. There's fixed, that's it, but a boom, right? And when I got in a little better position and all of a sudden they started going, oh, well, we can shave off a half a point or we can do this. And then the light went off for me. Oh my gosh, this is actually something that's negotiable. And then getting intentional, which I love that you use that word as well. I'm a big fan of getting intentional. Get intentional about going and pushing back, right? Like go to other financial institutions and find out, whether credit unions or even other banks, and find out what they're prepared to offer you for interest rates on some of this. And it's surprising, even those just little few points can make such a big difference if you're negotiating here and there. It adds up. So beautiful.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
Now, tell us a little bit. We talked about sort of your no spend challenge, which I love. I think that's a great, and for all our listeners out there, I invite you to accept Jen's challenge on that, that no spend challenge. Tell us a little bit, pay off your debt for good. I know that's one of your best-selling books. What would you say are the top tips that our listeners and your readers can expect to get out of that?
Yeah, so I made this one especially for people in multi-year debt payoff journeys. So if you're working on a lower income or you have a large amount of debt that's going to take you 2 or more years, then this is the book. I spent a really great deal of it talking about motivation, because you can know what to do and how to do it, but if you don't have the will to do it, you won't complete your debt payoff. And so talking about internal versus external motivators and why we need both, but like at different times. I talk a lot about habit building and just little things that you can do to support yourself along the way so that you can execute these great plans that you've made.
So good. So good. And I like this idea of motivators. Can you give us maybe even just a couple of examples of each, that what are some internal motivators versus external motivators, just to give some context for our listeners?
Yes. So internal motivators are things you do just out of the joy of your heart. External motivators are rewards. So when I'm trying to pay off debt, I pay off a credit card, I go out to eat, that's an external reward. When I cook at home because I just enjoy cooking, that's an internal motivator. And I don't personally love cooking, so that's not an internal motivator for me, but for some people, it is. Right. So we have to start with external motivators, but all the while be developing our internal motivators. We have to look for what those are, because studies have shown external motivators, when you're starting something new, they'll work for about 6 to 9 months. And then after that, you've got to be relying on your internal motivators. So for me, when we were paying off debt, it took me about 12 months, I think. And at the 1 year mark, I was very hopeless. I was like, we have a year to go. We've
Yeah.
been doing this for a year. I don't know how I can like keep going. And we were doing exceptionally well. We had cut 3 years off of our debt payoff goal, but I still didn't think I could do it because it was really hard. So I started writing so that I could help people learn what I had learned. And that was the internal motivator I needed to keep going. That last year sped by because one of my values is teaching. So I was able to teach people the things I had learned, and that fueled me for the rest of the journey. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to do it more so that I could share more with other people. And so that we need both, but at different times and in different proportions.
Oh, that's so nice. I love that. And again, as someone who loves to sort of teach and to write, I totally
Mm-hmm.
resonate with that. But what a great awareness for our listeners about there as well, about that balance between those internal and external motivators. Because if you're wanting to change your habits, you're going to need both of those, I gather, right? You can't get all the way there with just those external motivators. That's going to die out at some point. So really great awareness to help bring more intention. I think that's beautiful. So I can't believe how quick our time has gone here, Jen. This has just been so great. We're going to have to get you back for a round two with more advanced tips.
Yeah.
I'd like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? And it doesn't have to be on this issue. It can just be one of those aha moments that you've had where it shifts how you look at things.
I think I'm continually evolving in my mindset from this middle class mindset of scarcity to continual growth. And I think I've got it. And then I realize that I'm still struggling with it. So I don't like, it has been the most life changing to realize like I am not capped at a certain income or a certain capacity, that I can be ever growing in my income and ever growing in my capacity. And so that is a shift that has changed my life the most, but it's also a shift I'm continually making.
Oh, that's a beautiful one. And again, what a great note to end on. Because, and again, I grew up in a low rental apartment in Scarborough. And, I look at where I live now and think back, how far I've come. Like I would not have thought it conceivable growing up as a kid. And yet still, you hit the nail on the head. It's that constant growth mindset around scarcity versus abundance. Just don't just see that fixed pie, but just expand the pie and trust in that ability to expand the pie. I think that's beautiful insight. Well, thank you so much, Jen. This has been an absolute pleasure. I've learned some tips here. I can't wait. I'm going to listen to it again myself and take some notes. So thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights on this important issue for people.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And if your listeners want to get more from us, we have an episode dropping every Friday, Frugal Friends Podcast. And we also have an ebook that's free, frugalfriendspodcast.com/ebook. And it's got 200 ways to save money. You can take what works for you and leave what doesn't. We just give you a lot of options.
Oh, I love that. I can't let that go. Give us a few of those of your 200. What are some of your favorite sort of ways to save?
Oh my gosh, we've got so many. So my probably favorite is to shop secondhand. I've gotten like this laptop that we're recording this podcast on, I got at a pawn shop. My engagement ring I got at a pawn shop. Like I buy all my clothes at thrift stores. So save so much money. And then also negotiating is one of my favorite ways to save money because it's how you make those, $3,000 moves over time versus the $3 move of skipping the latte. So it's those big money movers that really do it for me.
Oh, so good. And where do they find the ebook? Is that on your website or?
Yep, it's on our website. And then frugalfriendspodcast.com/ebook will take you right there.
Perfect. And we're going to make sure to have that stuff in our show notes as well. So again, that's frugalfriendspodcast.com. And you can also check out Jen for her Instagram as well on Frugal Friends Podcast. That's a tongue twister.
It is mouthful.
So I am sure you have all got just loads of value from this episode. If you haven't already subscribed, please make sure to, and share this with anyone that you think could get some value from this message. And again, who cannot benefit from getting some advice about how to sort of manage debts? Because we all are there at some point, changing those habits so that we can, I love Jen's philosophy about being able to live your fullest life as well, so that, frugality doesn't become a dirty word. So make sure to share this. And make sure to join our Women on Purpose community if you haven't as well. On Facebook, under groups, just Women on Purpose community. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.